All right, folks, it's time. Thank you, everyone who has joined so far for joining our webinar today in content discovery in Islandora 8. This webinar will probably only be 30, 40 minutes to an hour. We'll leave some time for questions at the end. My name is Spencer Rayner. I'm the growth manager here at Discovery Garden, but I won't be presenting to you today. We also have Daniel Atkin, our product evangelist here at Discovery Garden, one of our knowledgeable long-term staff who's here to talk to you about content discovery. So Dan, floor is yours.
All right, thanks. So hello, everybody. Like Spencer said, we're going to be spending a little bit of time at the end of this for questions, so feel free to put them in the chat if you'd like. But other than that, there's just a few things that we're going to talk about today. And in each step here, I'm going to kind of give a little bit of a demonstration of a couple of things. I've prepared what are not necessarily a huge amount of ideas, but a couple of different ideas that hopefully will serve as a launching point for some further discussion, or maybe some further brainwaves about content exploration and discovery. We're going to break this up into 3 different parts here. I'm going to first give a brief overview of repository items as a sort of a concept, what even those are, what it is that is going to go into the repository, and what sort of information that we store in the repository about these things. And then we're going to go into, well, how does somebody visiting your repository find things? And then once they find things, what do they see about those things? And how can we use that to sort of feed back into finding more things? And then hopefully by the end of it, in both of those parts, we'll take a look at some examples of ways to do content discovery and content display, and then we can do a few questions at the end when we have time for that. So first off, let's have a chat about repository items. So if you're unfamiliar with this, a quick primer on this. Islandora is a place to put things of all sorts of different types into a repository. A repository item is the type of content on the site that represents those things that are going into the repository. If you're familiar with other types of content management systems, this is like a page or an article on those types of sites. It's just one thing that somebody fills in a form. It makes a thing that goes into the site. People visiting the site can see that thing. That's really all it is. The only difference being that it has some special functionality attached to it, and special bits and pieces of the site that allow it to behave as something in a digital repository, rather than just a sort of an ephemeral page or article that you usually see in a content management system. If you're familiar with Islandora 7, the previous version of the software, these repository items are equivalent to Islandora objects. The difference now being that they're actually things inside Drupal, the content management system, rather than just a representation of a thing living somewhere else in Fedora. But beyond that fact that they're just a type of thing living in the content management system, there's a couple other things we need to know about them here. First, that repository items have information attached to them. All that really means is that they know things about themselves, like who made them, maybe some subjects about them, maybe dates regarding them, or locations or other things, like things that when somebody's filling out the form to make a new repository item, stuff that they fill out. It's information about the thing. And so we can sort of store a lot of information with a repository item. You can have descriptions and notes and all sorts of different things. And all of these things can become important for discovery and display. The things that you're attaching to repository items have a bearing on how people are going to navigate your site. And we'll take a look at that in a second. The second thing we kind of need to know is that repository items, these things that we're putting in a repository, can be related to other repository items. If you're familiar with the previous version of Islandora, this is similar to how objects could be part of other objects. So you have things like collections, where things are part of a collection. By making these relationships, you can have a sort of a hierarchical structure for your repository. It's not just a bunch of things that you throw into a repository. They have a structure to them, and that structure helps people find things. So when they're navigating your site, they don't just see a huge wall of things. They can navigate through them. That structure goes upwards. So things are part of a collection, which can be part of another thing, which can be part of another thing. We can see sort of in the image to the right of the hand of this slide, this is a collection, and this collection contains a bunch of images. Those images are part of the collection. This is the most basic kind of structure that we have in the repository, is collections and the things that are in those collections. The last thing we need to know about repository items as far as search and discovery goes is that there are also media in the repository, images, audio files, videos, the actual things that you consider to be your digital preservation items. Those also go into the repository and are attached to repository items. So looking over there on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see there's a bunch of thumbnail images. Those are all attached to individual repository items, which are attached to this collection, which is in the repository. So we've got this kind of structure here of things that we've put into the repository, media that are attached to those things, and collections that those things might be inside. This hierarchy and this set of information that we're storing about these things is all able to be used to sort and display content in the repository. And I'll give an example of this in a little bit, but the first thing I want to talk about here is, how do people discover things in the repository? Like, how are they actually going to find this? And to demonstrate this, we're going to talk a little bit about content discovery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and then I'm going to switch over to an actual demonstration. I have sort of a test site set up that has not a whole lot of stuff in it, but it's sort of enough to demonstrate the things that we're talking about here. Out of the box, an Islandora site has the ability to be searched, and it has a sort of a browsing interface, which allows you to, it's sort of a limited search. And those are the two primary ways of navigating through the site. But we can make it a little bit smarter if we know what we're putting in the repository. We can make filters, and we can make displays that show particular sets of content depending on what sorts of things that we're thinking about. And we can make discovery open up to further searching and browsing. So we can make discovery link to more discovery, which allows people to sort of find exactly what it is they're looking for. But rather than just talk about this, let's actually show a little bit of this. I'm going to move my screen share over to my other. There we go. So this is an actual development site, or it's a little sample site that I have set up. It doesn't have a lot of things in it. You can see it has, actually, let me zoom in a tiny little bit here. Just, that's not the zoom button. It's probably fine where it is. So you can see it has 25 things in it. So it's not that much, but I put a little bit of metadata and attached to it to all of these different things so that we can sort of have an example of how to browse through the repository. So the base things that I was talking about before, how we have searching and browsing, well, there's a big old search box at the front here. And if I search for something, then it brings me up a set of search results. And this is sort of the most basic way of exploring a website, right? Is that you have a search box, you type things into that search box, and it brings you to a set of search results. The other thing we have on this site is this explore button, which is that sort of browsing interface, which really just takes me to the same place, except you can see there's only 4 things in this list. The reason that is because the explore button takes me to anything that is not currently part of something else. So you remember before when we were talking about how a thing could be part of something else. Well, if it isn't part of something else, it shows up here. So those are the 2 basic ways that we have of organizing content on the site. But they may not be particularly useful, and we can do better by doing a couple of different things here. I've actually set up a couple of examples of ways that we can do this using completely out-of-the-box tools. I set up a couple of these in probably a good portion of a day. So they don't take too long to set up. The ones that are here are specifically using views, which is a component of Drupal that allows you to display curated sets of content. So rather than just displaying everything in the repository in a set of search results, I've got a couple of things that I threw up the top here, browsing subjects and photographers. So what do I mean by browsing subjects? Well, all of these things that we have in the repository, I'll just click on one as an example. We'll hop into this big old list of architecture and maybe click on a specific one, like this Greek church. So all of these things that are in the repository have the opportunity to declare subjects that they associate themselves with. In fact, there's a list down here at the bottom. So this Greek church claims the subjects of church and architecture, but a whole bunch of things in the repository could potentially declare that they are associated with those 2 subjects. And in fact, what if we wanted a list of all of the subjects in the repository, just so that somebody could go through and see, well, maybe I'm looking for something related to this specific subject or something related to that specific subject. Well, it's absolutely possible to create a browsing view that just shows you every single subject in the repository. Obviously, I don't have that many because there's only 25 things in this repository, but if we had thousands or tens of thousands, it may be extremely useful to have a browsing page that just shows you all of the different subjects that are in use in the repository. And this one is just made up for subjects, but really this could be made about anything, genres, people, essentially any piece of information that we store about these things that we're putting in a repository. We can make a list of it and allow people to navigate through and find exactly what they're sort of looking for based on this. The other thing that I prepared earlier today is this other browsing display for photographers specifically. So some of these things that I have in the repository have information attached to them that says which specific photographer took that picture. Well, because I have that information, I'm able to create another view, this one here, browse photographers, that shows me everything in the repository that is an image taken by a specific photographer grouped by that photographer. So we've got a few of them in here, and we have the individual images that they took, and we have links back to them. So I can click on this and say, like, That's an edit, like, excuse me, but I can potentially click back on one of these and go to the actual page, or just have this list of photographers so that I can see, who has actually contributed things to the repository, and have that sort of what'd you call it? Have that sort of attribution live here. So these are just two examples of things, and they are the two simplest examples of things I think that I had based on this very, again, small repository of 25 or so things that I put in here that just had a little bit of metadata associated with it. But, depending on how much metadata that you have associated with the things that you're putting in your repository, the possibilities get quite they expand quite quickly, I think, is what I'm trying to say here. So specifically for these two views, I actually have a file that I will upload once I am done here before we're taking questions. I've exported both of these views. That may not be useful to everyone. It's probably only mostly useful to those who are familiar with what configuration files in Drupal look like. But at the very least, it may be helpful to take a look at these on your own. They're annotated a little bit just because the exports have some parts that are specific to this sort of sample site that I've set up here. But it nonetheless may be useful for you to go in and take a look and see exactly how these were created. In this case, I'm just showing a couple of files that are attached to things, but you could show all sorts of things. You could put a description under here if you like. The point of this being that this is a different way to display content than simply a set of search results. If there is some piece of your repository of the things that you are storing, like the information that you have about these things that you consider useful for display, it can be gathered together in a view like this. It's also worth noting, I know I mentioned this before, but these are out-of-the-box solutions. These are things that come with Drupal that can be used to sort and manage display. But there are other tools potentially that Drupal integrates with. So for example, shorthand, if you're familiar with this, shorthand is an application that allows you to sort of create stories out of content, where people, if you're familiar with, going on the internet and visiting a site and scrolling down and seeing little pieces of content displayed, you can do that here as well to display content. I think the out of the box searching and browsing is fine, but there's some other stuff that we can do here that's really interesting, especially if we know what's in our repository and we know how we want to display it. I'm going to let up on this for a second so that we can talk about content display, because there's a bunch of stuff to talk about here. I am going to quickly switch back to our slides here for a second. I know there's questions. I promise we will get to this the moment I have finished going through all of this. So that was content discovery. We've got searching and browsing, but we can make more things to display content and information in a very specific way based on the information that we have in the repository. As for content display, there's a few things that we have here. So out of the box, there is a couple of ways that we display content, and you can kind of see it here. We display the thing that is attached to content. We display a little bit of information about the content. For our sites that we have set up here at Discovery Garden, we have to download links and another couple of fun things like, here we're displaying a compound, which is a specific type of grouping of content together that shows you all the parts of it. So we've got a few things linked here together, displaying sort of on the same page. And underneath this, we have a little bit of information about it. But this is not the only thing that we can do to display here. We can make this display smarter by doing things like displaying specific targeted fields instead of displaying all the fields. We may want to set field permissions so that only specific types of people are actually allowed to see specific pieces of information. Importantly, some of these things you see on the page are links. So you see like authored by and media use, these are links. Well, we don't necessarily have to link back to those things. We can link back to things like search results so that we can improve discovery. We can also link back to other pages if we've got other things that we think are useful for search and display, like if we've made other pages like views for discovery, we can link back to those as well. Actually, let me once again show you a little demonstration here of a couple of different things. So I'm going to share my share this page again, and let's specifically browse through. Go exploring in this collection because I'd specifically like to take a look at, let's just sort of pick one at random here. So there's a couple of things about this view that I've made a couple of modifications to and are also just worth generally pointing out here. So this is the basic sort of display that we have set up here, where it shows you a couple of pieces of information like how many views it's had, the actual image content here, and a little bit of information about the thing. And we hopped into here before and talked about a couple of things, but one of the things that we've done here that is more useful than the out-of-the-box solution for content discovery is that these links down here link back to things that we consider to be a little bit more useful than what you'd get out of the box. So for example, this link next to collections links you back to a set of search results showing you everything else that's in that collection, so people can browse further through that. In addition, these links down here are set up to link you back to a set of search results showing everything everything that adheres to that particular subject. So I can click on one of these and be brought back. Well, these parts of this collection are all in the same or all have the same subject, but you can see it links back to a set of search results rather than linking back to, or rather than just displaying some plain text or just displaying a link to an actual term or something like that. The way that we do that is using a module, which I'll provide a link to here at the end, called, the module itself is called Entity Reference Facet Linking. So these things that we have on the left-hand side here, where we have filters for search results, like these subjects and member of and things like that. We can also use that for linking back during search and display. Or linking back when we're doing content display. So that module we provide out of the box here, but can also just be installed on any site and allows you to use those same filters that we have for search results as filters provided directly by links on an actual page like this. So that is how this is configured here. I also did a little bit of behind the scenes configuration after making the content discovery stuff to, instead of just having a little bit of text that says subject over here on the left-hand side, to have it be an actual link to our list of subjects, because somebody may want more information about a set of, about a particular subject, but they also may want to just see all the subjects in use. So rather than displaying that as a little bit of text, I've turned it into a link. Um, it takes a little bit of intuitiveness, I think, understanding what it is that you have in your data and what your users intend to do when they click on a link. So it's a question of, do they want to know more about the thing that they're clicking on, or do they want more results that are like the thing that they're clicking on? Or should that thing that they're clicking on just take them directly to something? So it takes a little bit of understanding, and it may take a couple of passes of, well, one particular thing should link to a collection and one particular thing should link to a set of search results, and people are wanting to know about this and they are wanting to know about that, or even we want to display information about this and we want to display information about that. Like I said before, all of these little bits of metadata down here can also have permissions set on them. I'm not going to demonstrate that here, just in the interest of time, but it's worth knowing that each of these individual things, sort of out of the box, anybody can see them and anybody can get a little bit of information about them, but not necessarily. They can be locked down, which is another piece of who do you want to actually be able to view these things? For whom is it useful to see a particular thing? I'll show off one other thing that I was thinking of content display, just that we have set up here. So I'm going to go back for a second to the home. And let's hop back in the Explore tab here and pop in here for a second. So I've set up a little compound that we were actually looking at before, which contains a set of just a few of the things that are in this collection, just sort of grouped together. We've made some changes here to the out-of-the-box behavior of how these compound type repository items work. But it's worth noting that the changes that we've made to these compounds are pretty much made up with out-of-the-box tools. So blocks and views and displays and things like that. So we made some changes to this such that you can see titles of parts, actual thumbnails of parts when you're sort of looking through a compound, as well as the different sets of metadata about the part itself are not like looking at information about an individual image or about the grouping of images themselves is not out of the box behavior. But everything else is built with sort of out of the box tools, allowing us to have a sort of a more intelligent display of this so that we can look through individual images that are part of a set rather than having to go through a whole collection. This sort of display is useful here for grouping some things, but it may also be useful for cases like if you have oral histories, or if you have individual scans of images that you have front and reverse of. So for example, a scan of a pamphlet or a scan of a postcard or a scan of a trading card or something like that, where you have an individual item that has two different sides that you may want to display the front and back of. Something like this may be more useful than displaying individual images as part of a collection so that people can click through them. Or like I said before, if you have an oral history that you have an actual written transcript of, as well as an audio file of, it may be useful for people to flip back and forth and see the transcript and the audio file. There's a whole bunch of uses that are potentially, there are a whole bunch of potential uses for this. It sort of exists as a simple way to visualize all of the things that are part of something without having to browse through an entire collection, especially if something only has a few parts and only really needs to be linked through a little bit. So items that are attached to something else don't just have to be displayed in a collection, and they certainly don't just have to be displayed in a view. They can be displayed as part of the object display itself. So we've got a whole bunch of different ways to display content here. The idea being that whatever it is that you have in the repository, you have a way of displaying it intelligently. You have a way of figuring out how you want to display fields, how you want to have fields link back to other things. You have a way of developing displays for different things, based on what kind of metadata that you have attached to things, whether it be subjects or whether it be other types of things. You have ways of displaying the images that are attached to things, and you don't just have to display them when people are browsing to view the thing. You can display them in other contexts, like when you're showing other groups of things, like we have in this big old list of photographers. There are a lot of ways that you can create methods of browsing through content in the repository, which I think is it's one of the benefits that we have of moving to this system where everything is content inside Drupal, is that we're able to not only store these things in the repository, but we're also able to display them in intelligent ways. I've got a couple of them that I've created here, but I think we've seen all sorts of interesting things happening so far. And I don't know, I'm interested to see what we come up with. Every person that I talk to seems to have a unique set of content that we're trying to put in the repository. And the traditional concept of collections doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And having things like this where we can display content and link back to content in an interesting way, I think is going to very much, well, it's already changed the way that we're sort of displaying repositories here, but I guess I'm saying I'm super interested to see what people come up with in the future, or perhaps even what sort of displays they ask us to build in the future. I think that's most of what I had to sort of show off here. It's mostly just how do we intelligently display content that's in our repository, and how do we intelligently get people to find content in the repository, and how do we display information about things in the repository. I'm going to do a couple of things. The first being that I promised that I would upload the configurations for those. First things first, let me flip back to here so that I can pop over to the last slide just to say a thank you, but also to open it up to questions. But immediately before I open it up to questions and read through the questions that we already have attached, I wanted to upload the configurations into the chat that I displayed before, just as examples of how views are generated and how you can use them to attach things like images or completely create lists of different types of things that have links back to them. Just sort of slightly more intelligent ways of displaying your metadata. So I'm going to upload that, and I will read off some of these questions that we have here. So that's a good question. How is that subject list ordered? By frequency? Now, I thought it was ordered alphabetically, but you are right. It's ordered by frequency. So frequency is the default sort order for this. There is no reason that I couldn't change that to be an alphabetical listing. When you are making these displays, they take three components, essentially. They take a display component, which is what we're sort of seeing here is the name of each subject. They take a filtering component, which there is no filtering component in here. It's really only just showing us subjects. And it takes an ordering component, which I didn't actually add an ordering component. So it is just taking the first thing that it finds out of there and showing it. But if I were to add an ordering component, it probably would be an intelligent thing to actually add an ordering component for alphabetically, since that's probably the best way of browsing things like this. So in regards to the second question, could you browse by department? All it really takes is the fact that departments are listed as one of the things that are attached to repository items. So these repository items that I have here, I listed subjects about them, I listed photographers about them, I listed what collections they're part of, and I didn't really attach much more to them in terms of metadata. But there is no reason. So these particular photographers that I showed here, not only these photographers, but like anybody who's in the repository as a person can have essentially any metadata that you want attached to them, including what department they're from or anything like that. So there's no reason that you couldn't create a browsing interface for that instead. It's really any piece of information that you're attaching to anything here is available as potential metadata display. I'd been interested in mocking up something like that because I know that that's a very common request for institutional repositories. In this case, these were just, I had these photographs kicking around. These are all royalty free. So they were ones that I was able to throw into a demonstration site. But yeah, I would be interested in mocking up something that functions more for an institutional repository where you have lists of things like departments or publication status or things like that. Yeah, I think that's one of the fantastic things about this is that you don't necessarily have to make collections as long as you can create these displays that sort of intelligently display content. The idea of collections is sort of not particularly necessary. You can certainly maintain the search result display, but for everything else, you can really create your own displays that sort of more intelligently show how things are to be organized in the repository. For the question of is the granular level of permissions the field level new in Islandora 8? I will say it is new for Islandora 8, yes, in that in Islandora 7, we weren't really using Drupal's concept of fields, so we didn't have that functionality available to us. Now that everything is just content, we do have that granular level of permissions available. So yeah, that functionality did not exist in Islandora 7. And I know for a fact, just from, talking to a lot of folks, that was one of the most requested features was the ability to lock down individual fields, or at least have granular sets of permissions for individual fields. But it never ended up existing and does exist now. Do we have examples of newspapers in Islandora? So I guess I'll do these in order. But yeah, examples of newspapers in Islandora. Currently, So I actually do have an example in here that I threw in of, this is not, I'm going back to the home page. There we go. So I do actually have an example in here of a book that I threw in that really only has a few pages. Currently, books and newspapers function exactly the same. They function, let me quickly switch my display back so you can see the actual book. So I threw a book into this repository as well, just so that I have a little bit of variety of types of things. And the book really just looks like this with a little thing that allows me to flip through pages. Currently, newspapers function exactly the same as books. There is no difference between the two of them. That being said, in the future, we would like to have some more intelligent browsing for newspapers because we store things about those newspapers like related items. What actual publication is this particular newspaper part of? When was this published? What issue is it part of? What edition is it? You know, that kind of stuff. Like we store that information. Those are fields that are part of the repository item content type. So there's no reason that we can't build a better display for newspapers. It just doesn't exist yet. And I think this is part of why I'm saying it would be interesting to have more intelligent displays. And I think this is one that we would like to do in the future, is have an intelligent display for newspapers. But currently they just display like this. But in the future, the same thing that we have for this photographer browsing thing, there's absolutely no reason that it couldn't be used more intelligently for something like publications that are then grouped by, you know, groupings of dates or something like that, or, you know, something that makes more sense in regards to a serial publication. Yeah, currently they just display as sort of books that you can flip through. Technical metadata fields absolutely can also be can also have specific fields opened up about them. So when we were looking before, let me hop back here. So when we were looking at before here, where we have specific fields that are being displayed here, all of these are just fields that are part of different components of the book itself. So when you're looking at it here and you see that there is a MIME type and width and height and all these sorts of things, those are also just fields that can be locked down. There is no reason that they have to be displayed to everybody. In the same way that anything else down here can be the resource type or the title for some reason, if you'd like to. All of those are things that can be, all of those are fields that can have specific permissions set to them. So for the question of like migration to Islandora 8 and whether or not the aspects of particular content will carry over, we have so currently the migration from Islandora 7 to Islandora 8 does not carry over permissions. It doesn't carry over permissions because permissions aren't quite handled in the same way in Islandora 8, whereas before in Islandora 7, we had a specific, like it was a mysterious sort of technical file that was attached to each object that defined exactly how permissions were going to work. Those don't exist here in Islandora 8, and in lieu of just sort of requiring that objects or requiring things in Islandora 8 themselves declare what their own permissions are. That being said, the process of locking down permissions on a collection in Islandora 8 is significantly easier than it was in Islandora 7. We've been using a specific module called permissions by entity, which allows you to set permissions on a collection and then automatically have those permissions be inherited on everything that is in that collection. So this is different than the previous method where you would set the permissions on a collection, you would declare that you want those permissions to be inherited to everything in the collection, you would wait for those permissions to be inherited for everything in the collection, and then when you put something new in the collection, you would also have to declare that it inherits permissions, or you might have to go in and specify permissions. Here, in Islandora 8, we are using a module that just allows you to set some permissions on a collection itself, and then everything in that collection it inherits those permissions as well. So as far as like shared content goes, things that are being shared between two collections, as long as one of those as long as one of those parent collections has the right permissions, those permissions will be inherited. And as far as the other part of it, like just being shared, the same sharing functionality does exist here as well. So if you want to share something between multiple collections, actually some of these things that I have are already shared between multiple things. So if I hop in here and take a look at this bridge of size, this is actually being shared between two different things. It's being shared between the collection itself as well as a compound, but it could be shared with other collections as well. So that functionality exists as well. So we've sort of recreated the inheritance of permissions here, and we've also recreated this sort of multiple hierarchy of things where they can be part of multiple collections. And the tools that we have to do migration support this sort of set of multiple collections where something can be part of two collections. It really just has to, like, it'll make both of those collections, and then it'll make the thing, and then the thing will be set so that it is part of both of those collections. So both of those pieces of functionality exist still in a way, and we've sort of recreated them here.
I think we do have time for a few more questions if anyone has any more. I think we've answered them all so far. Dan, you had mentioned a link to a module. Were you going to put that in the
yes
chat box?
I will put a link. I need to put a couple of things in here, actually. Couple of things. The first thing I need to put in here, which again is not useful for everybody, but may be useful for a couple of people, is those two views that we were looking at the top, the subjects and the photographers, which could be useful for other things. Is there a sandbox available? That's a good question, I think.
We can definitely, if you reach out to me, I can get a sandbox set up for you, something you could be able to play around in. I'll drop my email in the chat too.
Let me get the link to that module that we were using.
Sure.
This is specifically, so when we look at these links that are down here, where I link back to Bridge and Architecture as a set of search results, we are using that specific module for it. Will we have a choice for viewer for newspapers? Excuse me. Yes, out of the box, the only viewer that exists here in Islandora 8 is the OpenSeaDragon viewer. There's no reason that other viewers couldn't exist. There is no current integration with the Internet Archive book reader. So we don't have it as a viewer. The only real two image viewers are the base image viewer and this OpenSea Dragon, the sort of tiled image viewer. And then the other thing that we do not have is that sort of doesn't exist in Islandora 8 yet, is that view that goes by title, then year, then volume, and stuff like that. Currently, it's really only split up into collections. The idea here being that by making use of these sorts of views and things like this that display content in a different way, we could potentially, like, as long as those newspapers have years and volumes and things like that attached to them, we could do something like anybody could do something very similar to what we have here, where we have individual things broken up by photographers. We could have individual things broken up by year or by volume. We could even subcategorize things using the exact same method that we're using here. And then have links to individual issues of newspapers in here. Such a thing simply hasn't been built yet. I don't think we've quite seen, or off the top of my head, I haven't quite seen collections of newspapers yet in Islandora 8. So I suspect once people start creating newspapers in Islandora 8, that we will actually see better displays come up for this. But the point being is that these displays, the ability to sort things and subcategorize them like that, can be done using tools that are available out of the box. It doesn't have to be something that is custom built. Everything that I did here is something that is available out of the box. So I will say that either this is something that we will create in the near future, or it is something that somebody else will create in the near future, or it is potentially something that you can create yourself using these same tools. One of those three things, or maybe multiple of those three things.
Okay, perfect. Doesn't look like we have any more questions. Oh, you see
Sure.
that one, Dan? One more just came in there.
Is there anything we should understand about the underlying structure of Islandora 8 as compared to Islandora 7? So that is a great question. The repository. So the way the structure works now is that the actual what goes back to Fedora, or what goes back to whatever it is that you're using as the backend. So this site that we're looking at is using Amazon's S3 as a backend instead of Fedora, but Fedora is still available as a backend. The difference between 7 and 8, especially in regards to search and discovery, is that in 7, the source of truth for everything was Fedora. We were putting things into Fedora, and then here in Drupal, we were asking for those things out of Fedora. And there was no real understanding on the Drupal side of what those things were that we were getting out of Fedora. We were only really getting them out of Fedora. And then there was a bunch of code that defined how those things were supposed to display and how search results were supposed to function and all those kinds of things. And it all works, but it doesn't really have anything to do with Drupal. Drupal is really just sort of being used as a front end very lightly for us to get things out of Fedora and display them. The difference here is that these things that I've created, like the Greek church and the images that I've attached to them and everything else that we've got here, is being sent back to Fedora, or sent back to S3 in this case, as the sort of, like, backup of where it's being kept. but the thing that we're sending back there is Drupal in nature. And it still exists here in Drupal in the database. And all that stuff exists sort of on the Drupal end that we can use to play around in Drupal land and make things like these. So while it still goes back to Fedora or goes back to some other backend, we have far, far, far more tools here on the front end that we can actually use to display it in unique ways. So that's why I say, like, everything that we're looking at here, this view, and then like when we actually go into this set of search results that we're looking at here, and then when we go into an actual thing and look at it, all of this, the metadata display, the viewer here, the view count, the technical metadata, like all that stuff is being driven by Drupal. It's not coming out of the back end. The stuff that we've put into the back end just sort of lives there, and we don't need to ask for it. We can build these displays, and we can build these search results, and we can build these views, and we can organize this content using stuff that we like, the information that we store in Drupal itself. It is much, much more useful for actually creating search and discovery functionality than Islandora 7, where generally you would have had to write custom code on your own in PHP, make a module, install that module, have it do the thing, run all that testing and stuff. That's not really necessary anymore here. All of this stuff was built using out-of-the-box tools that do not necessarily require that there to be code on the back end. Yes, to answer that in a word, I guess. Yeah, and this is the thing, right, is that Fedora was never really intended to be used as a front end or as sort of a file system that was driving a front end. The tools that we have here on the front end for doing things like caching, and I mean, caching is the big one, I guess, but doing things like caching or doing better database requests and things like that, it is significantly more performant. We're not asking Fedora for anything. We're putting things into Fedora or into whatever the backend is that we put up here. Yes, across the board, it has been significantly faster. So not only faster, but also much, much, much easier to write custom things for. And much, much easier to make these custom displays and custom search results and custom discovery launching points and all these neat things that we have now. Anyway, oh yes, that is a fantastic point. So when we're looking here at a set of search results, I'll just look at the base set of search results. This is still being delivered up by Solar. And it will probably continue to be driven, like this particular set of search results will continue to be driven by Solar because Drupal still becomes less performant when you like ask it to do a lot of crazy filtering. Whereas Solar is sort of custom built for giving you sets of search results with crazy filtering and all sorts of weird things. So this particular, like what we're looking at here, is still being driven by Solar. That way we can have all sorts of weird filters and all sorts of crazy stuff and, sort it by all sorts of crazy things. And we really just need to index the right fields. I will say as well that this is significantly more performant as well. Because what we were doing back in Islandora 7 is we were taking every field we could possibly get our hands on and putting it into Solar, whereas here we are really sort of picking and choosing specifically which actual fields that we want to link. and or which actual fields that we want to index into solar, and which ones we want to actually display here. So we're not sending these gigantic solar documents back to solar where it has 5,000 fields and we'll never use 4,900 of them. Yeah, it's anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that it's still using solar here for the search results, but it is significantly more performant than it was before. I still haven't put my slide notes in the slides, so I will do that, and then Spencer will be able to send those out to everybody.
Yeah, I'll send all the notes and the links you had there, Dan, and I'll also send a recording of the webinar. So if you want to share it with a colleague or a friend, you can do that. It'll be uploaded to YouTube on our YouTube channel.
Perfect.
Doesn't look like there's any more questions. I'd like to thank Dan for your time today.
No problem.
Yeah, very well done, and everyone who joined. And again, if you have any questions in the future, feel free to reach out to us. We love answering your questions.
Heck yeah. All right.
Other than that, everybody have a nice rest of their day.
Thanks so much, all.